Assalamu alaikum jami'an. Good afternoon, everyone. Really, I'm proud to be part of this team and to be part of this amazing conference. And also my privilege to present one of our global experts, which is the Prof. Donna Ryan. So Donna Ryan is a professor of Emeritus at Pennington Biomedical in Baton Rouge in Louisiana, US, where she had a 25 years, mashallah, career in clinical research on obesity. She was an investigator of bound lost drugs, which is a cross-genetic and non-genetic component, and also the metabolic syndrome. She published more than 300 research, and we are proud to be here, and we are really privileged to be part of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I am delighted to be here. And I'm so impressed, and I applaud your very ambitious goal of showing the way to the world about how we can bend the curve through public health approaches. You know, I was fortunate enough to be part of the SELECT trial, which was a breakthrough trial I'm going to talk to you about today, a breakthrough trial in using medications to prevent cardiovascular disease in persons with obesity. And I want to see that same breakthrough occur in prevention of obesity. And we will get there. It's just a matter of time and commitment. So I'm so thrilled to see the public health authorities in this country endorsing this plan. Go for it. Okay, so thank you very much for having me here today. And I was assigned this topic, cardiovascular benefits of GLP1 receptor agonists. So I was thinking about this, and you know, yeah, it's true. There are many benefits of the GLP1 receptor agonist. It's about more than weight loss. I mean, we love these new drugs, tirzepatide and semaglutide, because they produce robust weight loss. But it's about more than that. And guess what? They do have cardiovascular benefits, but they also have additional benefits beyond cardiovascular benefits. So I think I want my title to be Benefits of GLP-1 Receptor Agonists, More Than Weight Loss, More Than Cardiovascular Benefits. These are my disclosures, and I have a lot of relationships with companies who make drugs, devices, commercial weight management programs, and I also do scientific work for some of these companies. So this is where I want to take you today. We're going to start off with talking about native GLP-1, this naturally occurring hormone in our body, and why it's a very, very good target to develop drugs around. And then we're going to talk about how we develop medications based on that GLP-1 molecule, and how this triggered the development of additional medications from other nutrient-stimulated hormones. So GLP-1 is a nutrient-stimulated hormones, and there are others that are also being exploited in the pipeline, and we're going to go over that. And then we're going to talk about the evidence for efficacy of these drugs in diabetes, in obesity, and now we have an indication in people with overweight and obesity and in people with diabetes for cardiovascular risk reduction, cardiovascular disease modification. And then we're going to talk about emerging evidence for the efficacy of these GLP-1 receptor agonists in other diseases. And then we're going to finish up with what it means for everybody in this room. Okay, here's our timeline. So we first observed that the GLP-1 molecule was associated with increases in insulin secretion in the presence of high blood glucose, the incretin effect. That was 1987. And then in 1996, GLP-1 was observed to reduce food intake. So its effect centrally on appetite has only been known since 1996. The first GLP-1 receptor agonist, exenatide, was approved in 2005. The first GLP-1 receptor agonist, liraglutide, was approved for weight management in 2014. In 2016, we observed that a GLP-1 receptor agonist in people with type 2 diabetes reduced cardiovascular events, our first positive cardiovascular outcome trial in diabetes. And then last year in 2023, with the SELECT trial, we demonstrated that a medication, semaglutide, indicated for obesity and weight management, was good at preventing subsequent cardiovascular events. That hopped ahead. I'm trying to move it back. Okay, well, I'm just going to go forward without that slide because I know what I want to tell you. So the next thing that's happening this year, in 2024, we've had just a huge wealth of information about the positive benefits of these GLP-1 receptor agonists in multiple disease states. Okay, so now let's look at native GLP-1. This is the naturally occurring hormone in our body. So after we eat and food passes into the intestine, the L cells in the intestine secrete GLP-1. And it goes throughout the body. There are receptors for GLP-1 in the pancreas, on the heart, multiple areas around the body, and goes to the brain. And in the brain, it tells the brain food is on the way. In the pancreas, it tells the beta cell to secrete insulin provided the blood glucose is high. But we know this molecule has pleiotropic effects, many effects. It's not just about reducing food intake and not just about improving glycemia in people who have diabetes. It affects the kidney. It promotes natriuresis and diuresis. It lowers blood pressure. It makes platelets less sticky. It has an anticoagulation effect. It reduces postprandial lipids. It's slowing gastric emptying. And so the lipids that are produced following a meal are lower with this drug. And it also has powerful anti-inflammatory effects. There's also some evidence from animals that it is cardioprotective. So all in all, this is a really good molecule to try to target for health improvement, right? And so we know, we have an indication for it. That's been around almost 20 years. These drugs are great in diabetes, right? We also know that they've been around for a shorter period of time, at least 10 years, that they have an indication in chronic weight management in people with overweight and obesity. But it's a really good drug to test for cardiovascular risk reduction because all of these pleiotropic effects make it likely that it will have an effect on reducing cardiovascular events mediated through some of these things in addition to mediation through weight loss itself. Well, can we advance that, please? And maybe I could get we're going to move this forward. In the back of the room, please move this forward. Okie dokie. Huh, that's okay. Here we go, yeah. So, okay, here are the medications that we have that are GLP-1 receptor agonists. There's over on the far left, we have the GLP-1 molecule. It's a peptide. It has about 36 amino acids. Very simple. The first one approved for diabetes was exenatide, then lixisenatide, epinglitide, liraglutide, dulaglutide, albiglutide, semaglutide, and tirzepatide. All of these were approved for the treatment of diabetes. Lixi, epinglitide, and albiglutide have gone away. They're not marketed anymore. But we still have multiple GLP-1 agents that are on the market for the treatment of diabetes. And we have 3, liraglutide, semaglutide, and tirzepatide, that are approved for chronic weight management. And so they're approved for both diabetes and obesity. So how do we go about changing this knowledge of this peptide and make it into a drug? How do we change physiology into pharmacology? So look at native GLP-1 there on the left. It has a half-life of 1 to 2 minutes. So the L cells have to keep producing GLP-1 to to have that effect on glycemia and have the effect on weight loss. It's rapidly deactivated by DPP-4. So, you know, we've developed medications, the DPP-4 inhibitors, that are used in diabetes, and that's all based on having more of these naturally occurring GLP-1 molecules in your body to have that incretin effect. But let's look at liraglutide. So liraglutide has 97% homology with native GLP-1. What they've done is that we've replaced 2 amino acids only, and we've extended a long fatty acid side chain onto the peptide. And what that does is it makes the compound resistant to the DPP-4, breaking it up and metabolizing it. And it also, that side chain makes it hang around in the body for a long time. So it has a half-life of 13 hours, and it's given by injection once daily. But then look at semaglutide. It has a bigger spacer and fatty acid attached to it, and it also has 2 amino acids that are replaced. It has 94% homology with native GLP-1, and it has a half-life of 165 hours. So we can dose this drug weekly, and that is how we convert physiology into pharmacology. And we take it a step further with tirzepatide. So here I'm showing you the GLP-1 molecule, and there's another incretin, GIP. And GIP has a lot of similarity to GLP-1, but if you combine them together, you can hit both receptors. And so that's what tirzepatide does. And it also has components to it that make it long-acting, and it can be dosed weekly. So our interest in these gut peptides that help regulate food intake has really spurred the development of many more molecules. So we know that the gut-brain axis is very important in the homeostatic regulation of food intake. This is how our body tells us when it's time to eat and when it's time to stop eating. So after we eat, the hunger is produced in the stomach by a hormone called ghrelin. And after we eat, food passes into the intestine, and the small intestine produces GIP, GLP-1, PYY, xanthomodulin. Nutrients are absorbed. Those nutrients signal the pancreas to release amylin, insulin, and glucagon. And all of those molecules, those nutrient-stimulated hormones, have an effect on food intake. They also have other effects. They're like GLP-1. They have pleiotropic effects that we're trying to harness. So one thing that's really happening right now in trying to develop medications that could perhaps alter the chronic diseases, that could be used for diabetes, could be used for obesity, and could be used for perhaps other diseases, other complications of obesity that challenge us so much, are these other nutrient-stimulated hormones. So in addition to GLP-1 and GIP, we've got glucagon. And so combining GLP-1 with glucagon might produce better results in terms of clearing liver fat. Glucagon is also thought to increase energy expenditure, so it might be a good drug to pair, a good molecule to pair with that GLP-1, and we might get more weight loss and have better long-term weight loss maintenance. And then you could even do a triple agonist. So GLP-1, GIP, and glucagon is currently in phase 3 as retatrutide. We're also developing long-acting amylin analogs. You know, that's a hormone produced by the pancreas in response to a nutrient stimulation. When nutrients are absorbed, the pancreas will stimulate amylin. And so that's also being developed in this way. But what's going on thus far is that GLP-1 is forming the backbone of all our approaches, and you're going to see why shortly. Okay, so this is where I've taken you so far in my outline. And we're going to move on now for the evidence of efficacy of the GLP-1 receptor agonist in diabetes, in obesity, and in cardiovascular disease. So you know, the FDA started requiring these cardiovascular outcome trials really sort of in the early 2000s. And so the DPP-4 inhibitors, none of those medications had a positive cardiovascular outcome trial. They showed non-inferiority. They didn't show an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, but they didn't really show any benefit. But the GLP-1 agonists in persons with diabetes have been shown to reduce cardiovascular events. And so that's true for liraglutide, it's true for semaglutide, and it's true for dulaglutide. So we know that these GLP-1 agonists in people with diabetes can reduce heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death. But is that being mediated by the glycemic effects of the drugs? And indeed, when we do mediation analysis of those studies, it looks at least 40% of the benefit is mediated through improvements in glycemia. So translating that effect into people who don't have diabetes has been something of a challenge. And in fact, it would be important to do that, to do cardiovascular outcome trials in people who have obesity and overweight, because they are at increased cardiovascular risk. So this is a study that looks at the incidence of myocardial infarction over 7 years of observation, and look at the individuals who've had a prior MI. These are the boxes on the right, and in blue we have those with diabetes. So over the 7 years, more than 40% of people will have a myocardial infarction. They've already had their first MI, they have type 2 diabetes. In the subsequent 7 years, more than 40% will have their second heart attack. If you look at individuals who don't have diabetes, who have had a prior MI, it's about 20%. 20% of those individuals will have a subsequent MI in being followed for 7 years. It's exactly the same amount as people who haven't had an MI, but who do have diabetes. And we know that diabetes is a strong driver of cardiovascular disease. It's what's called a cardiovascular risk equivalent. So it's important for people who've had a prior MI, whether or not they have diabetes, that we come up with good approaches to prevent that subsequent myocardial infarction. The problem with overweight and obesity is that we have not heretofore shown that we can actually reduce cardiovascular events. Now, the SCOUT trial with sibutramine unfortunately showed that there was increased cardiovascular risk in people taking sibutramine compared to placebo, and that drug was removed from the market because of that. Rimonabant was under study in a cardiovascular outcome trial, but rimonabant was removed from the market because it had a signal around depression and suicidality. So that study was stopped. The LIGHT trial of naltrexone and bupropion was underway, and an interim analysis was done. And the interim analysis was leaked, and that ruined the study. So it had to be stopped. The naltrexone and bupropion was taken up in a new cardiovascular outcome trial, but that one was stopped when the drug was sold and the new owners decided not to continue with the new cardiovascular outcome trial. Only one cardiovascular outcome trial with a medication for obesity, lorcaserin, has actually been completed. It was designed to be non-inferiority, to show that there was no increased risk of cardiovascular events in people taking lorcaserin. And indeed, that's what it showed. But we know lorcaserin is no longer available because it had a signal that perhaps it was associated with increased risk for cancer. So here we stand. We have medications for obesity, but we don't have any evidence that they actually modify disease. Yeah, they work through risk factors. They lower blood pressure. They improve lipids. You know, they ought to improve the intermediate risk factors for cardiovascular disease, but we really need the evidence that we can actually prevent cardiovascular events. And that's why semaglutide, 2.4 milligrams, which was approved for chronic weight management in 2021, was the subject of a cardiovascular outcome trial called SELECT. Now, in this study, everybody was 45 years or up, they had had a prior heart attack, a prior stroke, or symptomatic peripheral artery disease. And they had overweight or obesity, but they did not have diabetes. Everybody had a hemoglobin A1C of 6.5%, of less than 6.5% at study entry. This is not a weight loss study. This is a cardiovascular outcome trial. So what we're doing is we're looking at, we're comparing semaglutide with placebo in a randomized fashion to see the development of heart attack, stroke, or cardiovascular death. That is the primary outcome. It's called a major adverse cardiovascular event, or a three-component MACE. Okay, so here's the results. So in blue, we have the semaglutide patients. There were 569 events in that group. About 6.5% of patients on semaglutide had either a heart attack, a stroke, or cardiovascular death. And then placebo. Placebo had 701%. That was about 8% of the placebo-treated group. Now, these people were all well controlled in terms of cardiovascular risk. 90% of them were on statins. They had controlled blood pressure. Their lipid levels were good. Almost all of them were on a platelet inhibitor. So this is on top of that, we got about a 20% reduction in major adverse cardiovascular events. And all three components, heart attack, stroke, and cardiovascular death, contributed to that. So this is a very big deal for all of us in this room. It means that treating obesity with a medication, semaglutide, has an impact on a disease. It can save lives. This legitimizes our work in helping patients lose weight to have improved health and improved outcomes. So if you look at who benefited from semaglutide, in all of the subgroups we looked at, men, women, young, old, high BMI, low BMI, everybody had a BMI over 27, but for all of those subgroups, there was no difference. Everybody seemed to benefit from semaglutide. And in fact, this is the magazine that's associated with the journal Science. This was called the Breakthrough of the Year. And in this piece, one of the things that they said, and I'm quoting it here, as the GLP1 story continues, one thing is clear. These new therapies are reshaping not only how obesity is treated, but how it's understood as a chronic illness with roots in biology, not a simple failure of willpower. And that may have as much impact as any drug. So I think it has. I think this is true. I think we've all benefited, and we're seeing more and more legitimacy to our field of helping patients with obesity manage their disease. Okay, so it makes us rethink what kind of medications these GLP-1s are, right? Yeah, they've got indications for diabetes, they've got indications for obesity management, for chronic weight management, and they also have a cardiovascular disease indication now, both in diabetes and in people without diabetes. So we're rethinking what those GLP-1s are. And guess what? That's not all. It's kind of like an infomercial. You know, you get diabetes, you get obesity, you get cardiovascular disease, and that's not all. Let's see what else we're going to get here. So in the last year, we've put out 6 papers from that SELECT trial, and it has really proven to be an incredible wealth of data that supports the efficacy of semaglutide in patients who are at high risk for cardiovascular disease. So one thing it showed, we have more than 4 years of data supporting the long-term efficacy, weight loss efficacy of semaglutide. We also looked at kidney outcomes. I'll tell you about those in a minute. We also looked at heart failure. 24% of the people in this study had established heart failure. And so we're going to look at the effect of semaglutide on those patients with heart failure. We also show benefits in terms of progression to type 2 diabetes and and also regression from prediabetes to euglycemia, a very good thing to do. We also saw an effect of semaglutide in this study on all-cause mortality and COVID deaths. Very interesting. We're going to be talking about that. And that's not all. In the coming year, this year, 2025, we have a slate of papers that we're going to be looking at the effects of semaglutide on inflammation in this study, the effect of weight loss. Was weight loss a big mediator of those events? We'll look at more on safety. That paper should come out shortly. Hospitalizations and a mediation analysis. So let's start with heart failure. So one thing that we did is we analyzed patients who had heart failure in the study, either HFpEF, heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, or HFrEF, heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, and no heart failure. Well, you know, semaglutide reduced MACE in all three groups. That's a great thing. And then we also looked, we had a composite heart failure endpoint, and that was cardiovascular death or hospitalization for heart failure. And the group with semaglutide had a reduction in that heart failure endpoint. Furthermore, the drug has been evaluated in STEP HFpEF, STEP HFrEF, and now we have tirzepatide being studied in heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. The semaglutide studies show that there's improvement in feeling and function. So patients are able to walk further with semaglutide. They also have an improved quality of life score. And those things are also demonstrated with tirzepatide, but they also have a reduction in hospitalization. And tirzepatide is taking that data forward to the FDA to see if they can get a HFpEF indication. One of the most interesting things that happened in this SELECT study was that we saw this very curious relationship between semaglutide, placebo, and cardiovascular death, and that's shown there in the middle. So when we designed this trial, there was a lot of rigor put into the statistical analysis, and we powered the trial, of course, on the primary endpoint, the MACE, but we also wanted to look at important secondary endpoints. And the first one we chose to look at was this cardiovascular death. Now, the statisticians require you to put in place, when you're examining multiple questions, when you're asking multiple questions of your data, you must be more rigorous and require a lower p-value. And so what happened when we looked at cardiovascular death, we see these curves where it looks like the semaglutide curve and the placebo curve are kissing in the middle. You know, what is going on there? If we look at so when we saw this did not meet statistical significance. So we were not allowed to do statistics on any of our other secondary confirmatory endpoints, like all-cause death on the left there. And you can see that has nice confidence intervals that do not meet 1. It should be statistically significant, but we're not allowed to test that. So what's going on with that cardiovascular death? This is so interesting. If you look at non-cardiovascular death, you see that the semaglutide group is doing much better than the placebo group. Well, the causes of death in the SELECT trial, it was driven by a reduction in cardiovascular death, but also, very interesting, there was a reduction in death from infection. Look at that. There were 62 deaths from infection in semaglutide compared to 87 in placebo. And this turned out to be largely driven by COVID-19. So this study was conducted from 2018 until 2023. And guess what happened during that period? COVID. Remember, that started early in 2020. And so if you look at this, we're seeing that about 24% of people in the study developed a diagnosis of COVID. It was the same in both groups. But if you look at adverse outcomes like hospitalization or death, which I'm showing you here, there was a benefit to those people taking semaglutide. So look at this, the occurrence of death from COVID in patients on semaglutide in red and placebo in blue. Unfortunately, I changed those colors on you. But that's an improvement. And so that means there were fewer COVID deaths on this. Isn't that interesting? What is going on there? Well, when we look at the cardiovascular death in this top panel, you can see that the pandemic didn't really have any effect, it appears. But the non-cardiovascular death, that is the COVID deaths that's occurring right, and I'm showing you the data this time analyzed not from the time of study entry forward, but by chronological time. And so you can see the effect of COVID on the non-cardiovascular deaths, and that's the COVID deaths. So I think what's going on there is that compared to the placebo, the patients treated with semaglutide had lower rates of all-cause mortality. That's driven both by cardiovascular and non-cardiovascular deaths. And the lower rate of non-cardiovascular death is due to fewer infectious deaths, and in particular, due to COVID-19. And so what we think is going on with that, why we see that kissing of the curves, is that there's this phenomenon called competing risk. In other words, if you're dying from COVID, you're not at risk from dying of cardiovascular disease. And so that's why we think we had that outcome. And so, I think what this really does, though, is it reinforces that in overweight and obesity, risk of death is due not just to cardiovascular disease, but many other things. And so semaglutide may be a very potent modifier of those other deaths. And we need to pay attention to that because it suggests other things. Now, the question I always get about this study is, well, is the cardiovascular benefit, is it mediated by weight loss? Well, everybody in this room wants it to be because we are all in the business of helping people lose weight, right? Well, look at this. I'm showing you here on the left what we did is we took weight loss up to week 20, and we categorized it by whether patients lost 5% or more or less than 5%. And so we're looking here at those who lost less than 5% in the top bar on the left, the forest plot, and then those who lost more than 5% on the second line. And as you can see, they're both favored increase rather than placebo. And if you look on the right, what I'm showing you here, there's the hazard ratios, and they're both going in the same direction. It looks like there may be slightly more in patients who lost more than 5%, but it's not significant. It's not statistically significant. And if you look at on this slide, these are the patients who lost weight in the dotted lines on placebo. They have the highest event rate. And then here we have the patients who lost less than 5% or greater than 5% on semaglutide, and they're virtually overlapping. So what I have to tell you here, get ready for this, it was not entirely mediated by weight loss. That doesn't mean it wasn't mediated by weight loss. That probably had an effect. But the drug itself also had a very, very powerful effect on reduction of cardiovascular events. And this occurs early before we begin to see weight loss. Okay, more positive outcomes. So in SELECT, we showed a reduction in our long-term kidney outcome, which was a progression of nephropathy. This has been validated in the FLOW studies of semaglutide in patients with type 2 diabetes, where we showed a 24% risk reduction in progression of nephropathy of chronic kidney disease. Look, we have evidence with tirzepatide on obstructive sleep apnea, which is very convincing and very powerful. Look at this, look at my two charts here. On the left, I have patients not on CPAP, and on the right, I have patients receiving CPAP. In blue, we have placebo, and in orange, we have tirzepatide. And we're looking here at apnea-hypopnea index. This is the number of events per hour. So at baseline, there were more than 50 events per hour in each of these groups. Can you imagine the poor quality of sleep with 50 apnea, hypopnea events per hour? It's virtually 1 a minute. And if you look at the reduction in that, it's reduced by 50%, down to 27 and 29% in those patients treated with tirzepatide. Really a dramatic improvement in obstructive sleep apnea. We also have evidence that's been published.
We have less than 1 minute.
Finishing up, okay. We have benefits in MASH, we have benefits in Parkinson's disease. So now we need to think, in addition to diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease, is it a kidney disease medication, a heart failure medication, a neuroinflammation medication, or a MASH medication? Yeah, well, you know, these things all fit together in our concept of how obesity drives cardiometabolic renal disease, but there's more. Yes, there's more. There are studies underway that are looking at the GLP1 receptor agonist in psoriasis, in asthma, in irritable bowel disease. So I think overall we've got our work cut out for us. And can we meet the challenge? What does this mean for everybody in the room? Well, I love this quote. More tears are shed over answered prayers. All those years when we were looking for effective medications for obesity, well, now we've got some, and now we've got to do something with that. And guess what? We have our work cut out for us. We do not have the educated workforce that can deliver these medications. It's up to us to help educate our primary care physicians, our cardiologists, our nephrologists. You know, everyone needs to understand these medications and how they work. We also need to have a long way to go to make sure these are not developed as luxury products. We need to make sure the people who need them most can actually afford them and have access to them. And we have a continuing research agenda. We need to know more about the downsides of these medications, and we need to know more about how they actually work. Are there class effects? Well, I hope there are, but we need to prove that. So far, we only have semaglutide with cardiovascular risk reduction. There are cardiovascular outcome trials underway with tirzepatide, and I hope and pray that they will be positive, just like semaglutide. And then I think we really need to expand on and improve on this knowledge. I mean, we're heading in a very exciting and wonderful direction, but there's really lots of work to do. But the most important thing, the 3 most important things to solve are access. These drugs can be life-saving. We need to get our heads around how they need to be used in people who are not our typical weight management patients. These are not young, healthy women who want to lose weight. No, these are older, sicker patients, and we need to get our heads around managing those patients. It's a little different from where we're coming from. So I want to thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Prof.
I apologize.
No, it's okay. So we're going to have, because of the tight of timing, we'll have 1 question. Dr. Sarah, Dr. Haddad, do you have any question from your side?
Just to thank Donna very much for a fantastic elucidating talk, but also to thank her for actually bringing us all together. So she is the mum of the MENA Obesity Society. Thank you very much, Donna.